What did it feel like to live in Britain during the 1960s? Not just the headlines, but the little things. The click of the gas fire on a cold morning, the smell of toast and dripping, the black and white telly humming in the corner as the family gathered round. It was a decade of change, yes, but also one of surprising warmth. Streets were safer, neighbours knew your name, and the milkman still came to your door. Children played outside until dark. Radios crackled with the Beatles and the Kinks, and for the first time in a long while, people began to believe that life could actually get better. In this video, we're stepping back into that world. 15 everyday truths about life in 1960s Britain that show not just how people lived, but how they hoped. From fashion revolutions to fish and chips on a Friday night, this is the Britain many remember and many more wish they'd known. The 60s marked a turning point. After years of rationing and post-war austerity, families began to feel a shift. More comfort, more colour, more ease. Real wages rose nearly 40% between 1950 and 1965. For the first time, working people could afford new furniture, appliances, even a holiday by the sea. You could buy a washing machine, a television, a car, not all at once, but the idea wasn't far-fetched anymore. Supermarkets began to replace the corner shop. Carpeted floors became more common. People didn't just survive, they began to live. It was still modest by today's standards, but the optimism was unmistakable. There was pride in progress, in being able to say, we've come a long way, and for many it truly felt like the best days were just beginning. The 60s didn't just bring new music, they brought a revolution. From the pubs of Liverpool to the clubs of Soho, a wave of sound took over the world. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, the Kinks. British bands didn't just top charts, they changed culture. London became the beating heart of the British invasion, exporting youth, swagger, and raw electric energy to every corner of the globe. Teenagers had their own heroes now, their own voices, their own style. Music wasn't just background, it was identity. And with it came mods on scooters, miniskirts, Carnaby Street fashion, and a feeling that anything was possible. Britain had gone from post-war greyness to leading the global stage, all through guitars, attitude, and a new kind of confidence. In the heart of 1960s London, something bold was happening, not in politics or music, but in fashion. Streets like Carnaby and King's Road became catwalks for the everyday rebel. Designers like Mary Quant introduced miniskirts that shocked one generation and empowered another. Youth wasn't just following trends, it was setting them. Twiggy, with her wide eyes and short hair, became the face of a new kind of beauty, androgynous, modern, untamed. Colour exploded, tights in neon shades, patterns never before seen in public. Fashion stores played rock and roll, and buying clothes became part of the cultural movement, not just a chore. This was swinging London, fast, fearless and unafraid to challenge tradition. Clothes no longer whispered status, they screamed attitude. And for millions of young Brits, what they wore finally matched how they felt. Free, loud and ready for the future. By the early 1960s, televisions had become part of the furniture. Around 80% of British homes had one, usually small, black and white, and proudly placed in the corner of the living room. It was more than entertainment, it was a shared national ritual. Families gathered to watch the news, the Queen's Christmas speech, or serials like Coronation Street. Children raced home for Blue Peter, while adults laughed along with Steptoe and Son. It was the golden age of television, simple, live, and deeply communal. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 had already hinted at this future, bringing millions together around flickering screens. But by the 60s, the telly was king, and for the first time, the country could watch itself evolve in real time. In the 1960s, Britain dinner wasn't complicated. Most families cooked with tight budgets and modest expectations. There were no international aisles in the shops, no spices from around the world. It was meat and 2 veg, fish fingers, beans on toast, and roast on Sundays if you could manage it. Lunchboxes held cheese sandwiches, maybe corned beef, always with crisps. Tea was strong, milky, and constant. Rice was considered exotic, garlic foreign, and pasta, that was tinned spaghetti hoops. But despite its simplicity, meals were home-cooked, familiar and filling. There was comfort in that plainness. People shared what they had, recipes passed down through generations. Food wasn't yet about trends or presentation. It was about getting through the day together, with full stomachs and full kettles. The 60s brought a shift in British education. The old system, with selective grammar schools and limited opportunities, began to give way to a more inclusive approach. Secondary education expanded, and comprehensive schools became more common, aiming to serve all children, regardless of background. More young people than ever before stayed in school beyond the age of 15. The leaving age would soon rise, and the idea of higher education stopped being a privilege of the elite. For working-class families, this change meant a real chance for their children to step into different futures. Classrooms filled with the sounds of chalk on blackboards, BBC school broadcasts, and slowly new expectations. The future wasn't just something to endure anymore, it was something you could prepare for. In the post-war years, jobs meant factories, mines, or agriculture. But by the 1960s, that began to change. The service sector grew, with jobs in offices, shops, and public administration. More women entered the workforce, and cities buzzed with new possibilities. It wasn't all easy. Strikes were frequent, and old industries still dominated certain regions. But there was movement, a sense that the country was shifting into something modern. The suit and tie replaced the cap and overalls. The job for life began to fade. Young people looked beyond their parents' paths. They wanted careers, not just jobs. For the first time, a future in something like advertising, journalism, or civil service didn't sound like fantasy, it sounded like the new Britain. In the 60s, the idea that men and women should earn the same wage for the same work was no longer radical. It was being said aloud, fought for, and slowly written into policy. The conversation had started, and women weren't backing down. The Equal Pay Act wouldn't be passed until 1970, but the 60s laid the groundwork. From sewing factories to teaching staff rooms, women began to organise, demand recognition, and challenge a system built on silent inequalities. It wasn't instant. Progress rarely is. But the spirit of the 60s, bold, rebellious, forward-looking, made space for the question that would reshape generations. Why should gender decide your worth? Indoor bathrooms were still a luxury for many in early 1960s Britain. Countless homes, especially in working-class areas, had outdoor toilets, tin baths, and no running hot water. Bath night meant heating a kettle, filling a tub in front of the fire, and sharing water between siblings. Privacy was minimal. Hygiene was effort. People carried buckets, wiped down basins and got used to the cold, or made do with public bathhouses. For kids, the memory of steam rising in the kitchen as mum poured hot water into the metal tub never really left. It wasn't glamorous, but it was shared. Struggles were collective, and comfort was built, slowly, one improvement at a time. The 1960s didn't just change fashion or music, it changed the rules. Laws that once punished identity, desire, and autonomy began to fall. Divorce became legal and accessible. Homosexuality was decriminalized in 1967. Abortion became legal in certain cases. The world was shifting. Censorship crumbled too. When the Lady Chatterley's Lover trial ruled in favour of publication, it marked a cultural turning point, one where literature, sex, and speech could finally begin to breathe freely. These were not just legal wins, they were signs of a society unbuttoning its collar. Britain wasn't just modernising, it was learning to say what had long been whispered. By the mid-60s, home life began to feel easier. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and even fridges became more common in British homes. In 1966, 60% of households had a washing machine, a major shift from post-war routines of hand-washing clothes. These small machines brought huge relief, especially for women still expected to manage housework alone. It meant more time, more rest, and sometimes the luxury of doing nothing at all. Add to that the explosion of television, with over 80% of households owning a set, and suddenly the living room became a centre of both rest and entertainment. Domestic life wasn't glamorous, but it was finally catching up to modern dreams. By the 1960s, the NHS had become more than a policy, it was a point of pride. Free universal healthcare was available to every British citizen, no matter their income, age or background. It was the safety net no one took for granted. Babies were delivered in maternity wards. Teeth were fixed without fear of bills. Doctors visited homes. Nurses ran clinics. And people trusted the system to be there when it mattered most. In a world still healing from war and rebuilding its identity, the NHS stood quietly in the background, doing something radical, caring equally for everyone. In the 1960s, Britain's youth wasn't just growing up, it was dividing into tribes. On one side, the mods, clean-cut, fashion-forward, zipping through cities on their Vespa scooters in sharp suits and desert boots. On the other, the rockers, leather-clad, motorcycle-riding rebels who worshipped Elvis, speed and raw rock and roll. Their clashes weren't just cultural, they were physical. Famous beach town brawls in Brighton and Margate made headlines, sparking moral panic about the out-of-control youth. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Young people were claiming identity on their own terms. They weren't copying their parents, they were inventing themselves. Whether it was a mod dancing to The Who in a smoky club, or a rocker tearing down the road on a Triumph, both groups represented something new. British youth with power, with taste, and with something to say, even if they shouted it in different styles. By the 1960s, the sun was setting on the British Empire. One by one, colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean gained independence. What had once been a global empire, the largest the world had ever seen, was now reshaping itself into something else entirely: the Commonwealth. For many in Britain, this shift was felt more on the radio than in daily life. News bulletins announced new nations, new flags, new leaders. But underneath the headlines was a deeper reckoning, with identity, with legacy, and with Britain's place in the world. No longer the unquestioned power, the country had to learn how to listen, not command. The Commonwealth that emerged wasn't perfect, but it was a step toward cooperation over control, respect over rule. And for a generation coming of age in post-imperial Britain, it marked the beginning of something quieter, humbler, and perhaps more honest. They called it the 60s, but it wasn't just a decade. It was a feeling. A time when Britain felt smaller, closer, more human. When the streets weren't just busier, but friendlier. When the future was uncertain, but still full of promise. We've looked back at 15 parts of everyday life: cold bedrooms, coal fires, scooters roaring through city streets, music that changed the world, and laws that dared to bend. And through it all, one thing stood out: a quiet strength in the way people lived, endured, and hoped. Maybe the houses were colder, the food simpler, the choices fewer, but somehow many remember those days as warmer, not in degrees but in spirit. Was Britain happier then? More united? That's for you to decide. But what's clear is this: something about that time still echoes in the hearts of those who lived it. Do you think the country was more connected back then? Did we lose something along the way, or simply grow in a different direction? Let us know in the comments. Because remembering isn't just looking back, it's understanding who we are now and who we used to be.